positively surprised, but quite surprised that my paper got accepted, because it's not very exegetical. It's mainly me thinking that there should be a debate about Kant and universal-based income, and I want to basically convince you that more people should be doing the kind of work that I'm doing at the moment. So I used to work on, and still work on Kant quite a bit, but I also worked a bit on universal-based income, but not necessarily from a Kantian perspective. But that's something I realized that Kant was really interesting for debates about universal-based income, because there are some elements of Kantian theory, for instance, focusing on dignity, that is very much in line with how universal-based income advocates try to motivate universal-based income. And there are other elements of Kantian theory that actually rather are at odds with universal-based income proposals. So I think that there can be really fruitful dialogue between Kant and universal-based income advocates. One thing that I noticed, okay, so one thing that I noticed is that there isn't much of a debate in the literature. I only know of one paper on Kant and universal-based income by Alessandro Pinzani, Forthcoming As Theory Moral Practice. Mentioned in footnotes somewhere, but if any of you, if you have work on Kant and universal-based income, please come to me and tell me that I should have read your work before I made that claim that there's no work on that out there. So I'd be really interested in that. So specifically what I want to do today is I want to argue, I want to make two claims. Firstly, that there is a Kantian argument for a universal-based income. There might be other Kantian arguments. I want to focus on one specific, often overlooked notion in Kant that I recently have become interested in, and argue that this notion, specifically the duty to self, to be useful member to the world, gives us reasons in form of an indirect duty to work towards the universal basic income. And then what I also think is interesting is if we accept this idea that I want to bring out in my case, Kantian case for universal basic income, this might be of interest to universal basic income advocates, because I think this idea can help them solve what I think is the main ethical objection to an universal basic income, namely that it's the form of exploitation of people who basically don't put anything into the universal basic income but get something out of it. And I hope that the Kantian framework can actually show that there is a false dichotomy in this debate. So I hope that Kantians can get something out of that, but also non-Kantian universal basic income advocates. Okay. One assumption that I'll be making for my talk is that I assume that a universal basic income is financially and otherwise feasible. Big assumption, if you think that's a problem, partly it's an empirical question, and feel free to challenge me in the Q&A and have some idea of why that is a fair assumption. Okay, so first part of my talk, basic terminology. By a universal basic income, I mean something that is paid regularly to every either citizen or resident of a certain country or territory, and importantly, the payment is regardless of ability and willingness to work. That's the unconditional element in unconditional basic income. There are a few other ways in which the UBI is unconditional, but the interesting one for my purpose is that you get that money every month, for instance. If you work, you get it. If you don't work but want to work, but for some reason you can't find a job, and you get it if you don't work and you don't want to find a job. So that's unconditional, and it contrasts with most welfare schemes. Welfare schemes are typically conditional. If you're on welfare, usually it's expected that you either work part-time, the welfare tops up your income, or that you look for work, that you study to get another qualification, or that you're medically unfit. This might not be the case in so much in some countries. Maybe some of the Nordic countries still have a somewhat better model, but in the UK, for instance, and I assume in the US, it is the case that it's quite difficult to live off welfare all your life. There are checks on whether people, I think in the UK, especially ridiculous, people need to prove that they have sent out 35 job applications a week. It is actually really difficult to claim that you're disabled and can't work. They scrutinize you until you don't show up for an appointment, and then you're declared medically fit for work, or until you get so depressed that you kill yourself or something like that. So there's been really horrendous cases like that where it's very clear that these benefits are conditional. So what's interesting is UBI, you get that unconditionally. Then one other important concept is workfare, which is the idea that conditional welfare schemes have the purpose of getting people into work. That's often a criticism, that welfare schemes lead to workfare, people are being forced to take up specifically paid for work. That will become important later. That what welfare schemes try to do is try to get people to undertake more paid work or undertake paid work at all. That's the purpose of these welfare schemes. Okay, so this is UBI terminologically. Let's turn to Kant and one interesting and often overlooked duty that Kant postulates. So Kant says that a human being has a duty to himself to be a useful member of the world, since this also belongs to the worth of humanity in his own person, which he ought not to degrade. So we have a duty to ourselves to be a useful member of the world. There is another interesting passage when Kant explains the kingdom of ends. He says, in the kingdom of ends, we are ends and means for each other. That's kind of weird, because you would think obviously we have to be ends for each other. But why means? Isn't that ethically dangerous to be a means? Because if you're a means, you might be a mere means for someone, and that's very bad. I don't need to tell you that. Wouldn't the ethically safe route be to be an ends for others, but not a means if you can avoid it? But Kant actually says, no, we ought to be means and ends for each other. I think that this claim, be a means for others, is equivalent to the idea that we ought to be useful for others. Because if I'm a means for someone, I'm useful for that person. So I do think that Kant, in various parts of his philosophy, acknowledges the idea that we ought to be a means or useful for other people. And it's even a duty to be so. This recently, and that's the thing that got me started thinking about that, two colleagues and friends of mine, Corinna Mead and Gareth Williams, have done work on this idea that we ought to be useful for others. And they've used this idea to discuss what's wrong with certain forms of exclusion. Specifically, that in the UK and a lot of other countries, asylum seekers aren't allowed to work for a living, which is a way of basically saying that here is a form of being a means for someone, or of being useful, that you're not allowed to do, right? Maybe work for a living. There could be other forms of being a means for someone, but your ability to function as a means is severely curtailed if you can't work for a living. And very similar problems you get in the case of involuntarily unemployed people who are cast out of the labor market because they don't have the skills that are currently marketable or desired. So there is it is basically an idea that helps us challenge certain forms of exclusion or of certain other forms of wronging people, that we must allow people to be a means for others on their own terms, obviously not as a mere means, but on their own terms. And so in this debate, one thing that becomes relatively apparent is that even though being useful is a duty to self, this duty often rather imposes constraints on others to not curtail your ability to function as a means, specifically on the state, to not make the case that some people aren't allowed to work for a living, for instance. So I suggest that we don't put too much focus on the duty to self aspect here, because it can also yield normative requirements on other people, this duty, it seems. And then importantly, Kant here doesn't say take up paid employment or something like that. It says be useful. And not all forms of paid employment, I think, are useful for others. And I will come back to that later on. So we ought to be useful, but this could mean that we do unpaid work instead of paid work. And then finally, one thing that's interesting that I will come back at the end of my talk is that this duty, I think it's pretty clear, it's an ethical duty. There is latitude in how we are useful for others. It's a duty to self. So this clearly seems to be an ethical duty, which means it cannot be externally enforced. Rather, there is rational or moral pressure on people to live up to that duty. And this will become interesting and of relevance. The ethical aspect of that duty will become relevant for the final part of my talk. Before I get to that, I want to argue that the duty to be useful gives Kantians or people who buy into that idea reasons to be in favor of a universal basic income. And that's the third part of my talk. And I do think that these reasons exist because a UBI does a better job than welfare schemes at enabling agents to be a useful member of the world. And it does so in three different ways, I think. The first is that welfare schemes are often conditional, are always conditional, and that often means that recipients are still quite vulnerable to exploitation. So welfare schemes often try to get people into paid employment no matter what, and that means that many of the jobs that welfare recipients are forced to take up are potentially exploitative. these are quite bad jobs, but people might know that they only get welfare for a year, or that they're expected to take any job that they're being offered. So there is a sense in which welfare does protect you against some forms of exploitation. If the job is super exploitative, you can quit that job. You might be on welfare for a while, but eventually you have to take up work again. So it does function to some extent, welfare as a protection, but a much better way of protecting your status as an end, not as an end, but not as a mere means for anyone, is a form of unconditional payment that secures your basic needs. I should also say, I'm assuming here that universal basic income is at least of subsistence level. This is actually somewhat controversial whether or not a UBI has to be subsistence level or can be lower, but I assume that it is subsistence level. Secondly, I mean, I already hinted at that. A lot of the most useful kind of work is actually unpaid, and it is currently the case that people aren't able to afford to do as much of this work as they would want. Good examples are childcare or taking care of elderly relatives, maybe volunteering, other very useful social work. If you have to work 35 hours, 40 hours, 50 hours for your paid job, you might not be able to afford as much of that as you want to do. And if you had a UBI that covers your basic needs, you could actually do more of this very useful, socially useful work. Thirdly, I also think that some paid for work is useless. And I'm here drawing on David Graeber's idea of bullshit jobs. So I think his numbers are dodgy. He thinks that 40% of jobs are such that they add no social value whatsoever. You could do away with them overnight, no one would be bothered by it. Colleagues of mine at my university in Bristol have done methodologically better surveys, and they suggest it's more around 8%. But what's actually significant is that it's not the case that certain jobs are completely useless and others completely useful. It's rather that many jobs that are in principle useful, some part of what you're doing in that job is actually bullshit and useless. Just personally, in my department, I'm currently director of teaching, which means that I spend a lot of time taking information from one Excel spreadsheet and putting it in another one, because we don't have computer programs that talk to each other. So somehow academics have to do that. You could totally do away with that if you just had a more efficient computer system. There are either bullshit jobs or bullshit elements of a job where you work, you get paid for it, but you're not really adding any social value, any value to the world. And often these aspects of these jobs are very frustrating. People wouldn't do them if they didn't have to do them for a living. So the idea is that if there was something like a universal basic income, that would allow people to exit bullshit jobs and do something that's more meaningful. So these are three reasons why I think a universal basic income would enable people to be useful much better than conditional welfare schemes. Now, here's an objection to that. You might say, okay, I agree with that in principle. UBI seems to be a better tool, but the duty to be useful is an ethical duty, and UBI is a policy proposal. And on a Kantian framework, you can't straightforwardly derive policy proposals from ethical duties, right? The debate in the background is how the legal philosophy relates to the ethical philosophy. I don't want to make controversial assumptions about that. Some people argue that there is actually a straightforward route from one to the other, but I don't want to help myself to that assumption, but rather I want to accept the challenge. So it is not the case that just because something would help us to fulfill an ethical duty, we should turn it into a policy. Rather, I suggest that it's not the case that we have any kind of direct duty to advocate for a UBI, or the governments don't have a direct duty to implement a UBI, but there might be a weaker relation between a UBI and there might be a weaker relation between the ethical duty and UBI. I suggest that we look at Kant's very interesting puzzling notion of indirect duty. So here's one famous example of indirect duty. Kant says, lack of contentment with one's condition, in the trouble of many worries and amidst unsatisfied needs, could easily become a great temptation to transgress one's duty. Then he says, therefore, we have indirect duties to secure our basic needs. But indirect duties, it's controversial what it is exactly, but what I take them to be is they are prescriptions to put in place, the means to satisfy one's direct duties. I think that indirect duties aren't actual duties themselves. I think there are a few passages where it becomes clear that indirect duty isn't a form of duty, but rather there's something like morally relevant considerations, or considerations we have because of certain duties we have, and therefore they come with a certain moral force or moral normativity. And I do think that they are roughly what we would now call moral reasons. So at least that's my take on that. They're not moral duties, but moral reasons. And I suggest that implementing or advocating for UBI is an indirect duty on the part of the state or citizens. Now, there are two problems with that suggestion that I see. There are probably many more. The two that I've put on the handout. So one thing you might say is it's a bit dodgy that I refer to indirect duties here, because they are typically duties to one's own character or one's own ability to live up to duty, and you have to satisfy them yourself. You can't have them satisfied by a certain policy scheme where your basic needs are provided. There are a few passages that would suggest that. For instance, we shouldn't be cruel to animals, because if we're cruel to animals, we're damaging our own character. This is not really something that someone else can do for me. And I actually think that indirect duties come in two different ways. There are definitely these indirect duties that basically tell you you can't do a certain thing because it's bad for your character. There's an indirect duty not to do that. But as the passage, the example of indirect duties I put on the handout shows, there are also some indirect duties that could perfectly well be satisfied by other agents or even the state. For instance, if it were the case that material deprivation makes it more difficult to live up to your direct duties, there's no reason to think that you yourself must ensure that you're not materially deprived. Other people could give you the necessary resources, or the government will give you the necessary resources. But I think some duties, some indirect duties, are such that other people can satisfy them for you. I mean, I think that the duty to be useful for others is a case where indirect duty to have what is required to be useful for others is such that this can be satisfied by institutions of the state. After all, being useful for others is clearly has a social dimension, and it matters what the social setting is for living up to a duty that has these obvious social dimensions. A second critical reply you could make is that you could question whether UBI really is the most effective or even appropriate scheme to enable that people are useful for others, right? So you could say that, yeah, if it was the case that you had a policy proposal or scheme that would greatly enhance our capacity to be useful, yeah, we have moral reasons to advocate for that scheme, but UBI isn't that scheme. And in that case, I would say that I hope to have given you three considerations why a UBI actually is a pretty good scheme that enables people to be useful. However, I'm open that if there are more effective schemes than UBI to satisfy these criteria, that you need to be protected against exploitation, that you must be able to engage in actually socially useful work, even if that's not paid, and that you shouldn't be forced into meaningless, useless paid work. If there is a better scheme, then maybe we have moral reasons to advocate for that scheme rather than a UBI, but I think a UBI is a pretty good candidate and seems to be better than conditional welfare schemes. These are the two objections that I put on the handout, but I'm sure some of you have some other objections. Two quick notes. I think there's one way in which actually a welfare scheme that is trying to coerce people by external pressure into being useful, how on a Kantian framework that's actually completely ineffective to induce people into doing their duty to be useful. Because if you think that what duty is all about is having the right motivation, external schemes, external pressure can't do that at all. It can coerce people into externally complying with the duty to be useful, but that's not really what ethical duty is all about. There is a very Kantian sense in which any external pressure is completely ineffective here. What we want rather as good Kantians is we want that people, or agents, are in principle free to be useless, but also have the external means and opportunity to be useful and freely choose to be useful. The second note, let's just briefly, because I anticipate that some of you will have questions about that. When you look at Kant's own remarks on welfare, it seems that Kant favored a fairly minimalistic welfare scheme. Right? So the idea is that governments have a prerogative to tax in order to give money to the poor, but they don't have a duty. A lot of people think that means that the Kantian welfare scheme is fairly minimal. And I actually think that the remark about welfare here might be completely irrelevant, because the point of the scheme that I'm advocating is not helping the poor. That might be something that happens if you give UBI. But the point is rather that this enables you, puts you in a good position to live up to a duty to be useful for others. So there's a sense in which I could happily agree that taxing someone in order to support the poor, okay, fine, it's, there's no duty to do that, but there are other reasons to have a UBI which would also massively benefit the economically worse off. And then I should also, as a final remark, say, before I turn to my final section, that this is just one reason why a Kantian might support a UBI. We could also think about how a universal-based income would enable you to live up to other duties and the duty to be useful, or how it might undermine other duties, right? And so here's really just one duty that's often overlooked that I think is interesting, and a UBI would be really good for put agents in a good position to live up to that duty. But obviously, there are loads of other considerations in Kant and in general that might speak in favor of or against the UBI. I'd be really interested to hear some thoughts of other Kant passages that are relevant, or just other ideas how connection can be made between Kant and UBI. That's me on Kant, and now, that's basically me on why Kantians should accept the UBI, but now why should UBI advocates be interested in Kant? Now, some of you might have already, some of you might have noticed that I'm making at least one very controversial assumption, namely that people, if they weren't forced to work by external pressure, they would still want to do some useful work, care work, for instance, or maybe even paid for work in order to top up the income, or maybe the same kind of work that they're doing right now because they think their work is intrinsically worthwhile, they enjoy their work. But it might not be the case that people do that. A lot of people might drop out of the workforce, and this could create problems pragmatically because certain jobs that need to be done wouldn't be done anymore, but also normative. I want to focus on this normative problem. Probably ethically, the most important objection against the UBI is the surfer objection. It goes back to a remark that Rawls made. The idea is that if you get a UBI, there could be a guy who is, I think, a trained neurosurgeon, so he could do really useful work and not many other people could do, but he doesn't like neurosurgery, rather he likes surfing. So he takes the money from the UBI and he spends all day surfing on the beaches of Malibu. And he also doesn't do any unpaid work. He doesn't take care of relatives. He enjoys life thanks to UBI. And there are other people who work, and some of their taxes would go towards supporting a UBI that then supports the lifestyle of a surfer. It is, by the way, a controversial assumption that UBIs would be paid for by taxes. There could be other ways of paying for a UBI. But for the sake of the argument, I accept that we would have a situation where some people work, some of the income is taken away, and subsidized a person who could work but doesn't want to, doesn't do it, lives off other people's labor. Some people think that's what exploitation is. If you live off other people's labor, it's unfair exploitation. There are a bunch of reasons why maybe we shouldn't accept that objection, but it is quite prominent in the debate, and for the sake of the argument, I suggest that we accept that objection and see what Kant has to say to it. Now, as I already said, there is one very Kantian reply, namely that the duty to be useful is ethical, and external pressure can't do anything in order to get people to fulfill their duty for the right reasons. But then I think less Kantian inclined people would reply by saying, we don't have nurses, people are dying in hospitals. The problem isn't whether people do that for the right reasons, we just need someone to do that, right? So they might resist this very Kantian reply. Here's another reply. I think it's really interesting that the duty to be useful is an ethical duty, because that actually points to a somewhat false dichotomy that the debate assumes. The debate assumes that either we can put external pressure on people to do work, but then you can't have UBI because UBI is unconditional, and you get it even if you don't do work, right? Or you basically have to introduce conditions. Basically, there's no way to pressure people into doing socially useful work if you don't have external punishment, if you can't take away their benefits. I think there is at least something that Kantians can say about a case where someone doesn't contribute to society even though they receive a UBI. This person violates an ethical duty, which means it's irrational what they're doing, it's blameworthy, they can be morally criticized for it. It's not the case that UBI advocates have to endorse the lifestyle of a surfer. What they should be saying is the UBI is unconditional, that's important, even the surfer gets the UBI, but we can still criticize the surfer if we think that the person should be doing their fair share or should be doing something for society. They are doing something morally wrong, they are maybe being irrational in a certain sense. We can provide them with reasons for why they should not spend all of their time surfing instead of doing some useful work, such as volunteering, taking care of an elderly parent. So there is an interesting third option here, because it's not the case that anything we have, so either we have a completely laissez-faire mentality where anyone can do anything if they receive a UBI, or we need to appeal to external sanctions and have and basically turn UBI into some kind of a welfare scheme where people have to prove that they meet certain criteria in order to receive anything. What I also think is interesting about what's interesting about a UBI specifically for the duty to be useful is that you might think that it's weird and moralistic that Kant thinks we ought to be useful for others. And I think that's partly because currently people choose their occupations partly out of financial necessity. Some people have to take up, they can't basically deliberate about what's the most useful job I could do. Rather, they have to think about, how can I satisfy my basic needs and what's attainable for me. But if we were in a situation where actually everyone is provided with the basic necessities unconditionally, then actually it would become quite relevant that you have a duty to be useful. And then that would be one of the criteria you should take into account, that you ought to give back to society because you're receiving, your basic needs are covered by society, right? So in the current situations, I think it may be a bit weird to tell someone who has to work a bullshit job so she can pay back her student loan that, you have a duty to be useful. But if it were the case that she didn't have to worry about the basic necessities, then I think the duty to be useful becomes much more interesting, much more relevant. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, we'll proceed now to the questions. The first person I saw was you, and then you, please. Maybe we take 2 questions at a time. And then...
do you mind if we don't do that, because I keep forgetting?
Oh, okay.
Answer quickly.
Well, okay, 1 question at a time.
Yeah.
Then first you.
So interesting. Thank you. I'll ask 2 questions. I have more.
You need 2 questions at a time. Okay.
That's right. No, you'll survive. Okay, they'll be related. The first question is, can you say more about the significance of the duty to be useful? The status of indirect duties in Kant's ethics is always like somewhere between take it or leave it, and like the arguments for the change. A lot of times people don't emphasize. So what would be, so when I think of a content reason, I want to feel the kind of, like a basic content commitment,
right,
really leads me to realize this importance of the duty to be useful. And I'll just say, as a contrast, for instance, if somebody gave me a UBI argument grounded in dignity, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, I see. Yes, well, dignity is a big thing. I can't. That's not a take it or leave it kind of. So that's one question.
I'll answer that directly. So, sorry, I should have been more clear. The duty to be useful is a direct duty, but I think we have indirect duty to bring about the situation where it is possible and easy for people to live up to that duty.
Can you just say more about why that's an important direct duty? In that formulation, to be useful to others.
Yes, I have a great answer for that. Kant said it. so I think actually the more important passage for me is where Kant says it ought to be ends and means for others in the kingdom of ends. And that's where Kant basically spells out the kingdom of ends and includes being a means for others. And I think being a means for others basically corresponds to your duty of benevolence. Right? If you're being benevolent, that means you ought to help others with their with their ends, and that is in a way equivalent to being useful for others. There is a sense in which it would be weird if Kant said you ought to be beneficent, but you don't have a duty to be useful for people, because being beneficent in a way is just what it means to be useful. That's how I would derive this duty to be useful. If you ask me for proper Kantian derivation, I think it is connected to his system. And then I do agree that indirect duties have a weird status in Kant, but I think they're really interesting and important because they help us to basically get at a lot of important moral considerations that might not straightforwardly follow from the categorical
I mean, I
imperative.
think especially given that what you're doing is a content argument for something Kant never addressed, the thought that Kant said it, I want to feel like a Kantian motivation.
Okay.
That's what I was kind of asking for.
Yeah.
But okay.
I actually also think that arguments of dignity are probably quite powerful. So I'm also happy to, in addition, add arguments of dignity. That's why I said there's just one potential Kantian argument towards the universal.
My second question is then, so you argue, suppose persuasively, that the welfare conditions are problematic for different reasons. Those conditions, in your definition of UBI, those conditions are proof that you can't work or are trying to get work. Why can't we not have a UBI that would have conditions on prove that you're being useful, prove that you're either performing a kind of care, that you're trying to perform care, or that you can't. There's not, it can't be useful to anyone. So the surfer would have to prove that they're doing something. They're cleaning the backyard of the surf shop.
Good. So great. So this proposal exists. It's called a participation income, where you either work for a living or you volunteer. I'm not entirely against that. I think there are certain pragmatic reasons why it might not be a great idea. Because as soon as you introduce conditions, it basically gets much more expensive because you are arbitrary. You have to pay for people to check that people are really volunteering, they're volunteering for the right charities, or they're doing their care work. And there's always a worry that some people actually would deserve the UBI miss out because they don't tick the right boxes. But I'm to some extent open to that suggestion, but I do think there is something very neat and straightforward about just giving money to everyone instead of wasting resources on administration and on potentially also some people really need the money losing out because of. I also don't trust any government that exists at the moment to come up with a good list of what charities it's exciting to volunteer for. Then, yeah, if you have it in the UK right now, probably childcare wouldn't meet the threshold of being useful, but going hunting for grouse or something would definitely be considered to be a very socially useful activity.
Yes, please.
Thank you. So again, I have a two-part question. One is very.
We have 4 minutes.
I'll be very quick. So the first question is, can you tell us a bit more about the content of usefulness? What constitutes usefulness?
Yeah, I think being useful means that you function as a means to someone's end. I don't know if that's enough content for you. No. I think Kant is in a way liberal about usefulness because so he thinks there aren't things that, as a matter of fact, are useful for all human beings. It depends on the kind of ends human beings set. I think that's part of his idea that other people are ends themselves; they can set their own ends. And if we are being beneficent, we should basically accept what ends they set and help them promote these ends, unless we think these ends are positively stupid. Then we have a prerogative not to help.
Right. So basically, it's generally contribution to the realization of the kingdom of men, maybe.
But to other people's ends.
Okay. So the second question is: so this passage is a bit. It's really strange. So it starts. The first clause talks about the usefulness, being a useful member of the world, and you interpret it to be being useful to others. But then after since this belongs to, so somehow it seems to imply that it's a duty to yourself. So like it's a duty to yourself to be a useful member of the society because it contributes to your self-worth, dignity, whatever, right? And it reminds us that idea that you have to cultivate, talents to be smart, to be skillful, skilled. So if that's the case, if it's a duty toward yourself to be useful, then the second page of the handout, they say indirect duties are duties pertaining to one's own character. So that's also fine too. But then advocating the duty to advocate the UBI.
Yeah.
Is that a duty towards ourselves or toward others?
No, I think that is a duty to others. It's an indirect duty to others. But I don't think the fact that you be useful is a duty to self is not super important for me. It's important for me that it's ethical duty, but I don't. In a way, I would be happier if Kant would say you have a duty to others to be useful. I think that would make more sense.
So is it a duty to help others to become useful? Is that
No.
the duty to advocate for a UBI?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, yes.
Okay, maybe just one more question, super quick. Yes, please.
Yes, so I have a question about your desire to ground usefulness to others in benevolence. It seems to me that that goes against Kant's conception. And the point is that being useful to others is something you do for your own status as a participant in a community of ends. You don't do it to help others. I see this actually, I mean, you're actually going against Kant's own argument when you try to ground it in benevolence. And I think also you're going against the rationale that Kant has. Namely, you're not trying to be useful to others in order to help them. You're being useful to others because that is what is involved in your being who you truly are as a member of a community of ends.
I think Kant in this passage doesn't really say what the rationale has to be for being useful to others. And I think it's relatively straightforward that you can't be beneficent to others without being useful to them. So that's why I think there is quite a tight connection between the two. Basically, one is the other side of the coin, right? One side is be benevolent, the other one is, or be beneficent, and the other one is, if you do that, you're being useful.
Yeah, but you can be useful to somebody without being beneficent or benevolent.
Okay, yes, I agree with that. Yes. I fully agree with that. But again, this is actually part of a different paper where I try to spell out what it means to be useful for others. I think if you do your paid for socially useful work, you don't do it for moral reasons. I think you're still being useful for others, even though you're not being beneficent because you're not doing it for the right reasons. Yes, I accept that.
I'm terribly sorry for the questions that remain. We move on with a talk that will be delivered by Leander from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and the title of her talk is Punishing Human Beings. So, Ashli, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let's step up real quick. Sorry. I've got lots all over the place, so let me start with this. First of all, a personal detail. I'm really grateful to be here. It's really important to me and my family to be here. My great-grandfather was born in Chihuahua, Mexico, so in a way, for my whole family, this is like sending Ashli back to philosophy. And so that makes this really special for me in a bunch of ways, but also I'm so excited to share this work and get your feedback. So let me start by saying a lot of what I'm going to talk about can be linked to a lot of what we've heard today, I think, actually. In some ways, I want to make clear I am setting forth one way to think about punishment, a Kantian theory of punishment. And so there are lots of different ways we can do this, and my preferred methodology is going to be the one that I'm talking about now. So primarily, I want to argue that we need a fuller picture of punishment, fuller Kantian theory of punishment. What that means for me is something really particular, though. That means actually looking at the past 50 years of scholarship on Kant's theory of punishment, work that looks at what is retributivism, how retributive was Kant, where is deterrence showing up in Kant, looking at that and saying that's all well and good. Those are questions we need to ask and figure out. But to deal with earthbound beings such as ourselves, does that theory give us the tools to talk about issues related to human beings being punished and how the state functions when it punishes people? So I wanted to say, you know, if you liked what you heard earlier, it would be convenient for you to assume or posit Helga's claim from earlier that the state of nature and civil society are a false dichotomy, or maybe you want to supply your own metaphor. If you don't accept the claim, but you do notice that there are instances or patterns of institutional wrongdoing, and you want more from a theory of punishment that doesn't just explain what the state is and how we got it, and what the parts of it are, you want what I want, which is to give an account of legal subjects that takes our full humanity into view. We are rational agents, but we're also embodied people. We have a social aspect. It's really important for us to be in community with others, right? And so Kant gives us a full picture of humans, by the way. We know this. And so I mentioned that to say, it's really important for me that the point of what I argue here is to say, how do we see that bigger picture? How do we position all the resources, and then what can we do with it? And the motivation for doing this type of work is, I think I'm following a bunch of wonderful scholarship that is looking, however you want to talk about it, rehabbing Kant or pushing Kant along, identifying what's bad, but then, you know, what are our options? You can identify the things that are bad and you can say, let's throw it all out and start over. Maybe all of the scholarship that's been done on the theory of punishment has been getting it wrong. That's not what I'm saying. That's not what I believe here. What I think has happened in the scholarship is that in asking the questions the way that they've been asked, we've actually been producing ideal theories of punishment, ideal Kantian theories that are going to be grounded in principles of freedom, right? So again, everything that I'm interested in is giving a full picture of who the legal subjects are. Yes, we want a theory of punishment, but we also want to know who's getting punished and how do we take sufficiently serious what type of people we are when we get punished and when we commit wrongdoing, right? So keep in the back of your minds that everything that I'm interested in, I want to give analyses that come from both the victim perspective and the perpetrator's perspective. So I'm not only interested in one or the other. I think that these additional resources, seeing the fullness of humanity in relation to a Kantian theory of punishment, that is actually going to give us more explanatory power when we want to look at when things go wrong, whether because we've wronged someone or because we've been wronged by someone or because it seems like our institution has the capacity to actually commit wrongdoing itself. Now to this one. All right, so how do I do this? In the paper, I ultimately argue that the way that we've been theorizing about Kant's theory of punishment leaves out humans to an important degree. Not to say that Kant wasn't attentive to what human beings were like, but if we don't bring in the full human being into our theory of punishment, I think that this results in a failure to properly appreciate what it means for embodied social human beings to be involved in the processes of legal punishment. So in the paper, first, I kind of outline some interpretations that explain why do we need the state. That's a good starting point, but also we got a lot of that story earlier, thankfully, so I will keep that very brief. Why do we get a theory of punishment from Kant at all? Also noting that, this was a big question of the 80s or 90s. Is there a coherent theory? I'm gonna take the easy way out and say, we talk about there being a theory of punishment for Kant. So yes, this is how we talk, and so this is how I will also talk. So in section 1 then, I'm giving some info to outline what are the interpretations, and then what are the interpretations that I enjoy the most and I feel like are getting it right. And it's not accidental why I pick out the ones that I pick out. So I'm hugely influenced by Sharon Bird and Arthur Ripstein, people who are looking at Kant's theory of punishment, seeing elements of retribution and deterrence, and trying to explain that in some coherent way that also keeps away the threat of consequentialism, right? We don't want to say that. I'm not talking about deterrence in a consequentialist way. We'll get to that point. Now, why Bird and Ripstein? So it's really convenient for my case, or for what I'm interested in, that not only did Bird and Ripstein produce or work on theories of punishment for Kant, but they later, in their legal works, talk about how the state might be failing to equally protect people. And they do this in their articles on battered women who abuse, battered women who kill their spouses and then try to claim self-defense, right? And so it's interesting there that what we see happening is they give a theory of the state or a theory of justice, theory of punishment. For me, I use those interchangeably, punishment and justice, because in, I think, the second critique, Kant says, when it comes to justice, or when it comes to punishment, justice really is like the content and the important bit. So, I'm using that in that way, but if there's a reason not to, please tell me. And so finally, I want to kind of wrap up this fuller picture by saying, now we introduce Kant's theory of human nature. We take seriously that there are lots of things about us that make us messy and lovely. Now let's look at those alongside this ideal theory of punishment. And what I'm building is a non-ideal theory that, it really supplements the theory, right? So the project is to build a more complete picture. It is not to replace the ideal theory. All right. So in section 1, right, what we get, I'm just checking the time here. What time did I start? 12:20?
Like 2 past the hour.
Gotcha, okay. So what I do in section 1, give some of the tools to understand why do we get a Kantian theory of punishment at all, right? And it starts off with being the state of nature and how we are compelled to contract. How do we get into civil society? There are different ways of understanding this. Bird and Ripstein are kind of figureheads for giving different interpretations of this, where in one way you have people like Bird and Hrushka giving kind of prudential arguments, like it's wise for us to leave the state of nature. Look at what it gets us. It can get us some assurances and protection, right? Finally, we have a way of enforcing rights, of course, through public authority, right? And then there's another interpretive camp, right? Ripstein is who I have in mind here, where actually it seems like constitutive of a legal system, it's constitutive of civil society, that is how we get like proper rights enforcement. And so the main difference there is like, it's convenient and wise for us to leave, and actually it's necessary for us to leave. But what I'm saying actually doesn't hinge on on really either of those things. Whichever one you like better, I think you can accept that and still hopefully get on board with me. So in section 2, this is where, well, sorry, let me back up a little bit. Let's go back to what are their ideal theories of punishment. So for Bird, you might know the 1989 paper, Deterrence in its Threat and Retribution in its Execution. That wasn't exactly the title, but that's what happens in that paper. She's given the theory of punishment, and she says, look, there are actually these two normatively distinct principles, deterrence and retribution. Now, when it comes to deterrence, this is how citizens' conduct is guided. We are given some messages about how to behave. They're made sufficiently public so that we know what we can and cannot do. And then when we actually violate someone, we violate or infringe upon someone's freedom, then retributivism kicks in at the level of punishment. So Ripstein kind of picks up that line in Force and Freedom and says, I'm not sure how much we disagree, Bernie Ripstein, but the different explanation that Ripstein gives is, I know they're playing. I'm like worried that it will become not playing. So, yeah. Sorry about that. I mean, I can't do anything about it, but
I may try to deter them.
I'm just letting you know, like, hey, listen to this talking here, doggies. So Ripstein says, you know, maybe the disagreement Ripstein have with Bird is verbal, right? We both see deterrence and retribution, but the way that Ripstein kind of packages it together differently is to say, but these are mutually supportive, actually. They aren't normatively distinct. They are, like, this is what it means for the state to be constitutive of, like, justice. Like, we're seeking justice, and this is how it's done, right? So again, I pick out these two. One, because I think that when we look at the doctrine of right, we can see both of these things. Now, maybe it's possible that you don't buy the deterrence part and you're like, no, Kant is a staunch retributivist. And that would make sense because there's a bunch of people who have said that historically, right? That Kant is a staunch retributivist. And so we get this kind of curmudgeonly picture of Kant as like, I'm Mr. Proportionality, and this is just what's going to happen. You violated somebody's freedom, and retribution tells us you got to get punished, and it's probably going to be pretty harsh. But what I detect in Kant is some sensitivity, actually, that makes me think, I don't know that it's not quite right to paint a purely retributive picture of Kant. And the reason for that is in the doctrine of right, while it's not the main project there, he is attentive to the fact that sometimes we need to take human beings as our subject of inquiry. And furthermore, think about how laws actually apply to human beings. And that should stand out, and I think it stands out to me, certainly. It stands out as being really different from giving a justification of the state and how we got to it. Now, again, this is not to say that Kant doesn't acknowledge our full humanity, but he gives us these little tastes of, well, don't forget to think about the human beings who are going to be subject to these laws. And also, sometimes we do need to kind of look over there and see what's going on. My project is to take him up and take him seriously on looking over there, right? And so I recognize the doctrine of right is not up to this project, but I am up to this project. How do we take human beings as a subject of inquiry in relation to punishment in particular? Let's see. So where we're kind of at so far is we've got this retribution deterrence theory of punishment. Now, if that captures everything we want it to capture, then human beings are going to be sufficiently taken into account in that picture. But what we don't get are explanations of how or why. And I think the closest and one of the most important moments in the Doctrine of Right that lets us know that Kant is concerned about this, but that he can't do it there, is when he brings up the case of infanticide. There in that chunky paragraph, we get so many amazing hints that Kant is attentive to. Somebody did wrong in this condition, and forgive me if this is not your preferred way of saying this, but maybe we should think about why this young unwed woman has killed her infant. Why? What has happened? What's going on in the society that this was her option, right? Now, the categorical imperative of punishment tells us that murder deserves the death penalty. And if you've read Jens Timmerman's 2022 paper on the quandary of infanticide, you see laid out there, I think really well, actually, the landscape of the different interpretations on this issue of where should we fall on this question of the woman who kills the unwed mother who kills her infant. And he references, I think, all of the major players who have given interpretations that we should actually practice lenience in this case. There's another kind of lenience that can be practiced, but I'm going to set that aside. And then there's kind of the straightforward, she murdered her baby, and so she should face the death penalty. So people have been interested in this when I've talked about it in the past, though it's not super involved in this paper. My position on this is lenience. If we take into account the factors of her life, the society that she's situated in, what her options are for living a good life beyond this moment, if she kept that baby, I think that lenience is the way to go. But again, this particular paper is not on infanticide. That is my next paper. So you just mentioned this example to say, look, this is where I think Kant is being sensitive. He mentions at the end there, and I'm making it out to be more beautiful than it is, but he specifically calls out the discrepancy between how the state actually brings about justice and whether the citizens feel that the consequence or the sentencing was just, right? And so I am endlessly fascinated in discrepancies in justice. The state does this thing that says, and it does it because justice requires it from the legal point of view. But the citizenry who makes up this state, who has consented to this public authority, actually feels, no, this doesn't seem quite right. And you can give a similar, you can think through the obviously the other case given in this point in the Doctrine of Right is the soldier's duel. What's at stake here is the social sense of self. People are trying to defend their honor, right? This is Kant giving us a little taste of, hey, people's honor matters, how they are socially perceived by others matters, and when our honor is undermined, actually it can prompt us to try to defend ourselves in a way that has us do something terrible, and not just terrible, but also committing a legal wrong, right? So, if though, at this point, all we have are the tools of retribution and deterrence, it does seem like we can, it's plausible that actually there's an interpretive camp that says, oh yeah, she does face the death penalty. It's kind of, if you read the Doctrine of Right in this straightforward way, where the death penalty is required in cases of murder, then the answer can be clear cut. However, I think that it's obviously not, because we have a bunch of people arguing otherwise. And so then I ask myself, okay, so what do we do? Here's this case that seems really important. Thank you. what tools do we have at our disposal to give a fuller or further analysis? Is retribution gonna do it? Deterrence can't do it, because by the way, deterrence is not in the justificatory story of the state or punishment. Retribution is, right? So, now speeding right on ahead, why I look to the battered women cases by Bird and Ripstein. Well, they give this theory. What I'm going to say, it's useful for us to start compartmentalizing a little bit or labeling a little bit in Kantian theories of punishment. What we get is an ideal theory of punishment. We get the story of the state and we get the story of the need to punish wrongdoing. But we get that in the most abstracted way, in the most idealized form that is grounded on the universal principle of right and innate right to freedom. Those are the tools we have there. If we look elsewhere, like to Kant's theory of human nature, where we see, we are embodied people, we are social people, there are so many other aspects of our life, which, by the way, our legal institutions typically do pay attention to because there are things like mitigating circumstances. So, you know, my another kind of motivation I have here is, if we think, oh, Kant is getting a lot of this right, and Kant is kind of getting things right in a way that maps onto our current legal and political institutions, what can Kant tell us? What resources in Kant do we have to capture mitigating circumstances? And I think it's going to be stuff like the facts about our lives. Now, in their papers on battered women, and I welcome you to ask me more questions about that if you'd like, but the short of it is they both come down on the side of saying, look, these women are appealing to self-defense. They should be entitled to, but let's look at the history of these cases and see that actually the state has not protected them equally. So in many cases of battered women killing their spouses, they're suffering after years and years of abuse, and then they do this terrible thing. There are often records of calling police for help, trying to get restraining orders. Time and time again, we see in so many domestic violence cases where actually this terrible thing happens at the end. She kills her abuser, but where was the protection along the way? And so, I guess to sum up, because I'm also at the end here, I just think what is needed now is what I'm providing, the non-ideal complementary details to add into the ideal theory. I don't want to throw that out. It can be useful in a number of ways. It can be useful as kind of a regulative notion of what the state and a legal institution should be, that it should be effective and that it should be properly threatening, and it should have an authority that is respected in good ways. It also should do its job and equally protect people and pay attention to infringements of freedom and take those sufficiently seriously. And so in this paper, I am primarily doing this methodological thing. First, to say, let's start thinking about these theories of these Kantian theories of punishment as ideal theories. And now let's introduce a need for non-ideal theorizing that lets us paint a bigger and better picture. I'm not in the camp of throwing out ideal theory. I want a combination because I want to pay attention to life here on the ground. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have more or less like 15 minutes for questions.
I'll love all your questions, especially the easy ones.
Martin?
Thanks for your talk. That's actually not a criticism, but rather a suggestion. If you look at the right of necessity, just because it struck me that the battered women cases might fall under that label, right? So right of necessity is interesting because Kant says basically, I think you're doing something legally wrong, but you can't be punished for it because punishment wouldn't work anymore because it wouldn't function as a deterrent. I think that's actually him doing non-ideal theory, right? And I'm thinking that some of the battered women cases could be parallel to the right of necessity, but it really depends on how you spell out these cases.
Yeah.
It's not. basically, if the woman is worried that eventually she might be murdered by her husband and the police is not doing anything, then that might be parallel. But if it's just that she's really, really angry about all the abuse, but not fearing for her life, then I think would be a different story.
Yeah.
It might still be compelling psychological story why she did what she did, but I think this right of necessity could be interesting.
Yeah.
Basically, punishment breaks down as a deterrent, and partly because in a way the judicial system has already broken down and failed the victim / perpetrator in the past, right?
Right. And so first of all, thank you for that suggestion. Very useful. And just a thought I've had along these lines is when deterrence goes bad, basically, when you as a victim are deterred from accessing the legal system because it has never showed up for you. And so I really do want to explore more those kinds of breakdowns. So thank you.
Here and then.
Yeah, thank you. This is great. I really, this project sounds really great
Thank
to
you.
me. And I think I just agree with, with like the general. So I guess what I wanna, mainly what I'm just asking for is kind of more ideas that you have about what other sorts of resources we might turn to if we're starting to turn to stuff on Kant and kind of human nature and that kind of thing. So I'm really, as you like, I think you probably know this about me, that I'm sort of interested in the fact that I think I think you're just right. I think Kant is absolutely sensitive to the idea that there's more happening in the story about punishment, but not just punishment, just, you know, sort of justice in general, that Kant has a bigger story about what's going on there than just the arguments about the justification of the state and its roles.
Right.
And that when we're thinking about the political philosophy in general, like we can bring in, you know, these sorts of concerns that are external to the justificatory story.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious where you want to go, like where would you look in Kant's work for other resources to draw on to start thinking about these very kind of issues?
Right. So first I want to say maybe one of the first things that I looked at and read a ton about was blood guilt. And of course, you know, your paper on blood guilt included there. Where I would look, so right now, where I go is Kant's very brief description of human nature, the predisposition to good, propensity to evil, and the religion. But there are also, I mean, there are a number of other places where he says things that I think, oh, there's a little clue in the anthropology, right? And so really the next push of this project is to take these suggestions and say, here are all of the places that give us reason to think Kant has these interesting things in mind about humanity and how embedded we are in place and time and what stays with us, right? I mean, that's something really interesting about blood guilt, that lasts through generations. And that's important for me too, because when we think of justice not being met or brought about, that can give rise to a kind of guilt that will last through, or anger that will last through generations, that a wrong not having been corrected. And so as I've been giving this talk and chatting with people, really, I already was looking toward the religion and some bits of the anthropology, but I'm kind of in collect more mode. Yeah, thank you.
Bryan?
Just a quick question about your title and how does it all fit together? Why is it not punishing persons? So what I'm getting at is, it's also to do with the blood guilt passage in the metaphysics. Do you think that dignity has a place there, or is it altogether a different topic?
Yeah,
So the difference between human beings and persons may involve something like the property of dignity.
right.
You know, I just wanted to know what you.
I'm so open to this suggestion. So a little anecdote, I gave a version of this paper at APA And I realized I got a good crowd because nobody knew I was gonna talk about Kant. So I got like a really general audience because of this kind of like large and vague title. But in seriousness, in all seriousness, this is, I just have to say, I think this is a suggestion I will take seriously in renaming this paper. I don't think that it actually captures what I want to be up to. And dignity will become very important for me. So, you know what, I'm a grad student, I'm working on my dissertation, and especially toward the end, when I look to the effects of mass incarceration, the effects of solitary confinement, things like that. Of course, in the victims' perspectives too, there's a bunch of moments where dignity seems to be undermined or violated or not even made possible by punishment processes or the legal institution. So this is just to say I take seriously the suggestion, and I think it's a good one. Thank you.
We will go in this order. You, and then you the last one.
Thanks. I'm really sympathetic to what you're doing overall. Critical question about the framing. I'm also confused by the human beings talk, and it sounds like there's a lot of background that you do have in mind there. But in the examples that come up, is it about their humanity? Is that what makes the example more complicated? Or is it just about that, well, applying justice in non-ideal social conditions, where it doesn't sound to me like in the infanticide case, the super interesting stuff about the collision anthropology brought up in the Q&A directly plays into any of that, or at least I'd be interested in more of a story about that. So I guess I'm still wondering how that like humanity framing, it never became fully clear to me how that ties into it, as opposed to just an analysis of unjust social structures or something to that effect.
Sure. So I want to be attentive to unjust social structures because I certainly believe those exist and that we have ample evidence of that. But it is important to me that I am thinking about centering persons or human beings as earthbound beings, because in the religion, and it's just, you're right to point out, I didn't give you enough details there, where he talks about our animality, our personality, and our humanity. I mean, those things we can describe in ways where actually I think I brought up the infanticide case as you know, it's the honor case, and honor is really about our social senses of self. How do we function in community with other people? How are we perceived in our social settings? And so it is important to me to focus on the human beings or the persons, but you're anticipating kind of the direction of my dissertation, which is the first half is going to really pay attention to human beings and what it means to be people, you know, things, beings like us. And then I turn to issues of historicity and embeddedness, social situations that only kind of exacerbate or attack our human vulnerability more.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, yes, please.
So thank you very much. You clearly have an exciting project, and I think the prospect for, you know, giving us a really nice and productive theory of punishment in an originating way out of Kant. So I look forward to seeing your work as you progress.
Thank you.
So I have more of a suggestion than a question. And you know, the more I think about it, it might be a little bit of a provocation given the direction you want to go. So listening to you talk about the infanticide case, which is really fascinating, right? I think about the contrary case in Kant, which is the supposed right to lie, in which there are no mitigating circumstances, right, under which you actually have a right to lie. And I think he's, you know, clear about that, and has his reasons. So that in a way forms a nice contrast with the infanticide case, right? But what you might want to do is work out, like, well, what is the underlying thing here that is consistent? And I think what you may find is that for Kant, the, you know, punishment is keyed to moral violations that ultimately make the state untenable, right? So the reason we do not have a right to lie is because the moral violation there is of the deepest kind that would undo the possibility of living together in general. And so, you know, there's something about infanticide that really doesn't get to the heart of the possibility of living in civil society in the same way. And you might think about these questions of what I would call human finitude in that context, right? What are the limits of our abilities to exercise our autonomy? So it might be interesting to think about it in that context. That might be a productive route that sort of really stays within the Kantian framework.
Absolutely, and I'm pleased to hear you give the suggestion because my advisor's in the room, so one thing is, I'm really, I'm really grateful,
Tell my students, think about this.
I have someone who I can spend a lot of time talking about the supposed right to lie with, so, and that's a direction I haven't pushed in, so
Right, but it
that's
forms an
super
interesting
useful.
contrast, and there might be something
It
there,
does.
like that there's, how can you hold both of these things?
Right.
And I think you might have a path.
I'm also, so thank you so much, and I'm also, glad that you mentioned human finitude in particular, because Fred and Helga both have heard and kind of given a similar comment of how am I thinking about or placing finitude in this, and so this is just more reason to really kind of get this locked down a bit. So thank you so much.
Okay, one last
I'm
question.
trying to be really quick, and it's a nice follow-up to Christie's question. So you use this term leniency in thinking about your non-ideal self-limit to Kant's ideal theory of punishment. And you talk about the infanticide case as an example where Kant seems to exhibit some leniency, and he seems to be lenient with regard to the question of how much the murdering mother should be punished. I was wondering whether or not, where you would come down, or whether you'd be interested in entertaining an idea, a leniency with regard to the question of whether to punish. Are there some crimes that, for whatever reason, shouldn't be, is there room in Kant for that kind of leniency?
Yeah, so I love this question, and as a person, I do want to, I want there to be room for that. As a person who also recognizes that is working within the constraints of Kant, I think I need to be really careful about how I approach this, because I think what we can get with Kant and Kant's legal and political works is we can get pretty good and come up with good reforms, but it worries me a bit as a hopeful Kant scholar to think about no punishment at all, because then we are maybe pushing into abolition territory, and we just can't do abolitionist Kant, I don't believe. And so that's not to say though that not punishing in some types of cases is necessarily an abolitionist framework, right? So yes, I want that type of leniency, but no, I have not figured out yet how to capture that. Yeah. Thank you all so much.
All right, thank you very much.
So it's lunchtime. I hope you all have the email that I sent with the locations. We have to walk towards the place that is to the right.
Restaurant?
Yes.
Which do you recommend?